engineer. He has been with the Baltimore District for 12 years. He's a graduate of Penn State University with a degree in architectural engineering, and he is a accredited professional with building design and construction specialty. He currently resides in Laurel, Maryland, and is working at the East Campus IPO at Fort Meade. His current projects include East Campus Building 2 and East Campus Building 3, and will be presenting on sustainable sites for us today. Again, if all of you could keep your mics muted and use the chat for questions, we'll try to address those as we're going through here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Actually, I saw Jansen logged on. Jansen, I wasn't able to start recording on mine for some reason, so if you're able to record, that would be awesome.
Thanks, Jason. I got it.
All right. Thanks, Jansen. All right. Welcome, everybody. Just wanted to welcome you to our installation of our sustainable webinar series. Today, we're talking about sustainable sites, and just want to encourage you, like Kelly said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and she'll be able to bring those up as we go along. I have no problem with us kind of addressing questions as we go, so feel free to put those in the chat. All right, so our objective for today is that we want to be able to describe the process for designing and constructing a sustainable site. And our resources, or the sources of reference that we're going to use for today, are, first of all, our UFC 1-200-02, which is our High Performance Sustainable Building Requirements UFC. And for those of you that don't know, there was an update to that was done in January. So there's some changes that have come out. I've tried my best to capture those and also make the correct references. If I missed one, like I said, I just updated it recently, so hopefully I got them all, but if I missed one, I will do my best to let you know. Second one is the International Green Construction Code, or IGCC. And for your information here, there's also a link to the Corps of Engineers Sustainability Microsoft Teams site, and you can get connected to that. It's a great resource. We post a lot of stuff on there. Files and the recordings from these webinars will be on that MS Teams team and site. Also, our Tri-Service Sustainability Program page on the Whole Building Design Guide. And last but not least, Lead Online. The links for Lead Online are also included here. So what are we going to discuss today? Two main points. We're going to talk about how to select a sustainable site, and then site development strategies. Those are really the two main aspects when it comes to a sustainable site and how we approach the process of making sure that the aspects of our site are sustainable. So when we talk about selecting a sustainable site, we're going to look at what site characteristics we want to avoid, and then in conjunction with that, what we're looking for in a site. And then the bulk of our time is going to be reviewing key characteristics and attributes of a sustainable site design. And we'll just hit on a little bit, some low impact development requirements, just a little bit in this one, but there's going to be some of that in some of the follow-on webinars. We'll finish our time today by hitting on some best practices and a couple of case studies on some sustainable design for sites. So like I said, our overall guiding document is our UFC 1-200-02. That's our high performance sustainable building reference document. And specifically when it comes to site design, we're going to be looking in Chapter 2. Chapter 2-2 refers to employing an integrated design. And there are really, at this point, with the changes that have been made recently, there's only one real section when it comes to site, and that is concerning site selection in 2-2.1.3. But we also have a couple of principles that we're going to reference in conjunction with lead requirements. And I know everybody is aware that Army primarily uses LEED and GBCI as our third-party certification provider and rating tool. If you are in another branch of the military, maybe you use something else, but we're going to make reference to the LEED points where they cross over with some of our points from the UFC today. So a couple of those are going to be the topic of mitigation of heat island effect, which isn't specifically addressed in the UFC, but it is referenced as a best practice in the appendix of the UFC at this point, and also the reduction of light pollution as well. So when it comes to site selection, our UFC 2-2.1.3 has a couple of other extraneous references in it, and those are that we have to meet UFC 2-100-01, which is our installation master planning UFC, and also 3-101-01, which is our architecture UFC. And so what the master planning one and the architecture UFC reference are some preferred characteristics for site selection. And the ones that are bolded on here are ones that were specifically called out in the SDD policy as priorities. And so the ones that are called out are adaptive reuse. And so what that includes is attempting to develop on a previously developed site, building orientation, maximizing energy efficiency by how we orient the building on our site. Location, so when we talk about location, we're talking about where it's placed in regards to access to utilities, amenities, transportation, things like that. And that gets into the next one, transit. What are the availability of things like public transportation? And then we also get into pedestrian access. And probably the most important from the perspective of master planning is avoiding sensitive land. So when we talk about sensitive land, we are talking about trying to avoid using green space that otherwise it has been untouched to this point. And then lastly, the last preferred characteristic is, do we have adequate parking facilities available? And so parking management strategies, we're trying to encourage co-use of shared parking, whether that's through carpools or whether we use, parking structures, things like that, where we don't have to develop large amounts of land. All right, so if you look at any particular site, when you're talking about site selection, with all the site preferences that we just discussed on the previous slide, when you look at these two sites, one, you see a kind of a residential community on the left, and on the right, you see more of an urban downtown setting. When you're asking yourself the question of whether each of those sites is sustainable, is that a fair question to look at a picture like this and just say, is this site sustainable? Maybe not. The first question you have to ask yourself is, what type of facility am I looking to place on this site? And so if you're thinking of a school might be a site like the one on the left in a residential neighborhood might be much more sustainable because it provides access to the things that we talked about. Easy pedestrian access, lots of infrastructure that's readily available. Maybe a school could also fit in an urban setting like we're looking at on the right, but it might require a little bit more development than what we're looking for in a residential neighborhood for people to have access to that school. So for site selection, once again, doing a little bit of a crosswalk over to our LEED rating tool. The LEED related credits for site involve site selection, and there's a couple different credits that we can achieve through LEED for site selection. The first one being LEED for neighborhood development location. We can achieve a potential possibility of 16 points, and the way that we do that is we avoid development of inappropriate sites. And so once again, this is trying to avoid sites that are going to require the need for a large vehicle distance to be traveled, ones that are going to provide enhanced livability and improve human health are also things that we're looking for. So we want to avoid development of sites that are going to prohibit those type of things. We can also get credit for sensitive land protection. And so when we talk about that one, we have 1 point possibility for sensitive land protection. That's avoiding environmentally sensitive land. And so sensitive lands would include things like prime farmlands, floodplains, endangered species habitat, bodies of water being too close to and impacting bodies of water, wetlands, things like that are what we're talking about when we mean environmentally sensitive. And then there is a possibility of achieving 2 points for choosing and selecting a high priority site. And so when we're talking about a high priority site, these are sites that have been listed on the EPA National Priorities List, and that could be a federal empowerment zone site, a federal enterprise community site, or a federal renewal community site. A lot of times as well, if it's the federal government, we could also be looking for a site, on some of our Army installations, if it's one where it was a previous, what do you call it? Can't think of the word right now, but an area where we may have had a firing range, and so there's certain aspects of cleaning up that site where it's a high priority to the government to be able to restore that site location. Some more LEED credits related to site selection, surrounding density and diverse uses, potential of 5 points, and that one is to encourage development in areas with existing infrastructure. And so when we're talking about existing infrastructure, we're talking about locating our site in an area where we have existing density within a quarter mile of the site or the project boundary. And so what we're talking about there is infrastructure where we have things such as food retail, community serving retail, services, civic and community facilities, things of that nature where the users of that site are going to have access and be able to have their lives enriched through that access. Also, the other one is that we can get points for in regards to site selection is access to quality transit, and that encourages us to develop in areas with existing transportation choices. Some of those are access to bus, streetcar, and transit stops within a quarter mile of our facility, or having access to bus, rapid transit, light or heavy rail, commuter rail, or ferry terminals within a half mile of our facility. All of those qualify as access to quality transit for our site. All right, so some LEED-related credits to that translate to site design. So once again, we talked about site selection, and now we're moving over a little bit to site design. So the first one is use of bicycle facilities, and we can get 1 point for that. And so bike facilities, we want to promote biking and transportation efficiency through use of bikes. And the requirement that LEED sets for that one is to have those bike facilities within 200 yards of a bike network, to have short-term bike storage within 100 feet of the main entrance of the facility, to have long-term bike storage within 100 feet of a functional entry, and to have some kind of additional storage and shower requirements that are based on facility use. So we have the ability for people to ride their bikes, but then also to be able to shower and not have riding a bike be an inconvenience for them in their use of the building, so that the shower facilities are also provided. The second one is reduced parking footprint, and there's 1 point possible for that. Reduced parking footprint means that we're trying to reduce automobile dependence, and so the requirements for that one, or what we're looking for, are to not exceed the local minimum code for parking capacity, and to provide a percentage reduction below the recommendations for parking capacity. The next one in regards to our site is the use of green vehicles. And so we want to put things on our site to promote alternative fuel vehicles. So we can do that by designating 5% of our parking spaces for green vehicles, and also installing things like electric vehicle charging stations in at least 2% of the spaces, and also providing things like liquid gas or a battery facility in 2% of the spaces. A couple more aspects of site design that are related to LEED credits. We have site development in the sense of protecting and restoring the habitat of the site for a potential of 2 points. And so we promote biodiversity by conserving existing or restoring damaged natural areas. And so what we mean by that is to restore 30% of the site identified as previously disturbed. We can do that through a number of different ways, or we can also donate 40 cents per square foot for total site to a land trust or a conservation organization in the region. That's also a potential way to achieve this credit. Doesn't really do anything for our site specifically, but it's also a way to achieve that credit. And then the second way that we can achieve a credit through site design is through our use of open space. And this is to encourage interaction of the building occupants or the facility occupants with the environment. And it provides them with outdoor space that's equal to 30% or more of the total site, and a minimum of 25% of that must be vegetated. So once again, it's open space that is for the purpose of enriching the experience of the building occupants. Another set of credits in LEED for in relation to the site are ones that are all about location and transportation. And so we have a total of 26 possible points that are related to the site out of 110 that can be achieved. 14 of those are impacted by our initial site selection. So like I said, there's two main aspects to sustainable site, the site selection, and then what features that we put on our site. So 14 are related to that initial site selection. And so that needs to be something that we incorporate into the planning charrette so that those considerations are taken into account early on. And then we have 12 points designed that are specifically about how the design of the site and what features we put on it can directly influence those. So 26 that our site can achieve. So getting back to our UFC, after site selection, there is some strategies that we can use to make our site sustainable, and these are interesting because they were previously on the last version of the UFC. They were called out specifically: mitigation of heat island effect and the reduction of light pollution. In the latest rendition, they have been moved into the best practices, and so they're not specifically called out anymore, but I figured it would be good to keep them in here just because they are best practices and we can discuss them. So heat island. For those of you who don't know heat island, the heat island effect is the tendency of urban areas to get warmer because of things like asphalt paving, hardscapes, things that don't allow the dissipation of heat in urban areas as opposed to more rural areas. And so, like I said, the concept of heat islands is no longer specifically called out in the UFC, but it is mentioned in the appendix, which is where we have our best practices. And so in Appendix B-1.1, it talks about heat island effect. And but it still does make reference in there to the International Green Construction Code, and so that's where we're going to take some of our guidance from in regard to heat island. And so in the IGCC in 501 3.5.1, what it talks about is that some ways to reduce heat island are that 50% of our site hardscape should have existing or new trees to provide shade to it. So that way we don't heat up those hardscapes. If we're going to use paving, we want to use paving with an SRI, and SRI means solar reflectivity index of 29 or greater. So we want things that are more reflective and aren't going to absorb heat. We use open grid pavers, which have, a lot of times will have pervious components to them. We use shade from structures, and then we do have an exception when it comes to hardscapes for climate zones 6, 7, and 8. So 6, 7, and 8, if you talk about the continental United States, would be areas like Montana, North and South Dakota, Alaska. We do have an exception for these hardscape provisions in those areas. Some more aspects of heat island when it comes to not just our hardscapes or our ground level site features would be our walls on facilities. And this one's covered under a different section of the IGCC. And what that section says is that we want to shade at least 30% on the east and west above grade walls for the first 20 feet. And 75% of opaque wall surfaces on east and west should have an SRI of 29 or greater. And once again, we have some exceptions to that one in climate zones 5, 6, 7, and 8. For east walls, the shading isn't required, and then also in climate zone 7 and 8 for the west wall, the shading is not required.
Jason, we have a question related to how the 50% of site hardscape how is that shading amount calculated?
50% of site hardscapes. So the previous slide having existing or new trees providing shade?
Correct. That's the one that I'm.
Okay. So I think what you're going to do in that situation is you're going to take a square footage and then of your total hardscape, figure out whatever that is, and then it would be a calculation based upon the estimated shading of those trees or the trees that are provided.
You don't have to know the answer. This is I think a bogus requirement. But I'm going to ask the question anyway, just in case you have done this calculation.
Okay.
What size shadow for the tree? Does it matter what kind of tree? Do you have any specifics concerning this? I've just always written it off. Like I'm a landscape architect. I show trees, but I just assume the calculation is too ephemeral to ever actually prove that I'll get this. So I just write it off.
Okay. Yeah, I don't honestly know how the full shading capacity of a tree is determined.
Yeah, so Mark Sullivan posted, I think that's what they say in the book, Mark, but the summer solstice changes based on your latitude, right? So like how that shadow is calculated, you got to figure out where you are on Earth, and it changes based on where you are. So like, do we really need to get into that kind of math?
I don't think anybody does it.
Yeah, I stopped doing it. That's right, because it's just complicated.
Good question though. Tell you what, that's one that I will kick over to Jansen that he can respond back to the group, and we'll try and come up with an answer for you.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Another aspect of heat island is, of course, our roofing, and this one's not quite as much related to the site, but I figured I would cover it because it is part of heat island, and the IGCC does speak to this one. So for the roof, we want to try to use a cool roof, which is one that has a specified higher SRI or solar reflectivity index, and should comply with Energy Star for the roofing products. And it's mostly applicable to climate zones 1, 2, and 3, but really you could apply it to other climate zones as well. So some of our hardscape strategies that I just want to kind of show some of these. Once again, if you're talking about shading with trees, I think everybody kind of understands that one. Not maybe how to calculate how that percentage is calculated, but we understand that we can use trees as a shading mechanism. But some other ones that we can also use are reflective paving. So this would be things like paving using concrete as opposed to asphalt, because concrete is much more reflective. Open grid pavers, where we have ones that are, maybe have some vegetative growth that's in the midst of them. When we talk about heat island roof strategies, we're talking about our the materials we use, because some materials are going to have a much higher SRI. And really, when it comes to meeting the requirements, we have different types of roofs as well. We have steep slope roofs, and we have kind of more flat slope roofs. And so for low slope roofs, we're looking for something that has a much higher SRI. A 78 or higher is preferable. When we have high slope roofs, we can reduce that, and And for steep slope roofs, we're looking for an SRI of 29 or greater. So once again, the intent of heat island reduction is that we want to reduce the amount of heat, specifically in urban areas, but as a general rule overall anywhere, we want to reduce the amount of heat that is generated by some of the materials that we use on our sites. And so we are trying to meet the equation for percentage of hardscapes with shade or reflectance. As we stated, not always the easiest thing to try and prove that out, but another one of the requirements that LEED has is to place 75% of parking under cover that's reflective, vegetated, or used to generate energy. So if we can do one of those two things, either meet that percentage for hardscape that's shaded, or placing our parking, 75% of our parking under cover that's either reflective, vegetated, or used to generate energy, we can get 2 points for heat island reduction through LEED. All right, and the next one is reduction of light pollution. So real quick, if you see the picture that's on the screen, I hope it's coming through pretty well, but does anybody, if you want to put it in the chat, does anybody know what you're seeing the outline of? Yep, good job, everybody. It is the outline of the state of Florida, or the Floridian Peninsula, and just based upon a nighttime view from space of the different cities and metropolitan areas. And so, you know, like, you're not seeing the very, very bottom, because as you get down onto the Keys and in that area, there's less population density, but you can really see all the different cities in Florida kind of as an outline. And I guess maybe the fact that people like to live along, you know, close to the coast. You see the effects of light pollution and what that can do in a community. And so what we are looking at when it comes to light pollution and sites is that our UFC says that we need to follow UFC 3-530-01, which is our design for interior and exterior lighting and controls. And so that one also refers us to the IGCC, the International Green Construction Code, sections 501.3.6. And so lighting pollution, when you look at it this way with this picture of the state of Florida, you know, trying to have spaces that can view the night sky is kind of the goal of light pollution, being able to enjoy the natural environment. And we lose some of that when we have light that's cast off in to locations that it's not meant to be, and just without any direction at all. So really, that's what we're going to try to do with our site lighting, is to make sure that we choose the correct site lights, and also that we have them directed to the locations where they need to be used. There we go. Okay. So from the IGCC, when they're talking about light pollution, what they are trying to communicate is that site lighting, or lighting in general on a facility, falls into these outdoor lighting zones. And so if you're looking at the presentation, you have LZ0 through LZ4, and those are the outdoor lighting zones that the IGCC identifies. So you go from LZ0, which is a lighting zone which should have no ambient light, absolutely totally dark, to an LZ4, which is one that should require high ambient lighting for security or safety reasons. So, and what that does is then these charts from the IGCC give us ratings for our lights and our fixtures that we use for backlight, uplight, and glare. And so then we can compare the fixtures that we choose depending on what light zone we are using them in, whether or not they meet the requirement for backlight, uplight, and glare. So there's a number of different types of lights that we can use on a site, whether they are ones that are overhead, if they are pathway lighting, if they are perimeter facility lighting. Like I said, they all of them have a certain amount of glare. All of them will overlight the area to a certain extent. And so what we're trying to do is, like I said, we're making sure that the light is selected properly for the purpose that it's intended, and also that we direct it to the area that it's most needed. We don't want lights that are inefficient and casting more light than needed, but we also don't want them to be directed just in a general sense everywhere and anywhere. One way that you can get a sense of that is to look at this. This is a building site, and it's showing lighting intensity levels. And so when we talk about our lights being directed where they should be, what we want is a building that has lighting intensity levels as what you've seen here. And so we want at our front entrance to be well lit. We want our parking lot and places where people are going to be walking around to be well lit. We want our entrance ways and our drive aisles up to and around the building to be well lit. And so when that's the case, we don't have that excess light pollution going off away from our site and away from our facility. But it's a very different scenario when you look at something like an intersection. Okay, so an intersection has much more. It's a really good example of when we want lights to be directed for the purpose of safety and somewhere where we really want some high light intensity. So we have an intersection. The roadways leading up to the intersection should get progressively brighter as we get close to the point where vehicles are going to need to interact with each other. And so, so that's what we see in this 4-lane intersection. We have light intensities dropping off the further away we get, and as we get to the point of intersection of the vehicles where it's required, we have those light intensities picking up. And that's done through the type of fixture we select, and also the placement and the directionality of those fixtures. So we are going to hit on a couple of case studies looking at some lights that were replaced and the reasons that they were replaced. This first one is the 10-tom spillway lighting replacement. And this was, and the photos aren't too great. Hopefully it's coming through on the webinar a little bit better. But the purpose of the photos are just to show an example of an upgrade that happened and the reasons for it. So the upgrades were accomplished. They're part of an energy saving performance contract strategy. And they were replacing on the left these real high mast, relatively inefficient and undirected light posts with, down on the right, lower right, you see new LED lights they're much more energy efficient, and they were effectively directed to the locations needing light. They weren't up on these high masts just kind of projecting light in every direction. They were directed exactly where they needed to be. So an example of a good light replacement project that got us, one, more energy efficient fixtures, but also ones that prevented light pollution. So when it comes to just crosswalking to our LEED related credit, we have a possibility of 1 point for light pollution reduction. And the intent is to, like I said before, increase night sky access so people can enjoy the night sky. And that's done through meeting the luminaire uplight ratings and not exceeding the backlight and glare ratings. Remember in the IGCC, that table. And also not exceeding the luminance limitations on signage as well. So we're going to kind of close up today with looking at a little bit of scope of influence. And what I mean by that is that, we start to realize that when it comes to sustainability measures, whether it's ones that are internal to a facility or on our site and external to our facility, that for them to really endure and be truly sustainable, we need to have broader master planning involvement. And, without it, all that kind of initial momentum that we generate to design and equip a facility or a site with sustainable measures, really, it won't last because we don't have the maintenance and sort of master planning backing behind it. And so there's some things that, when it comes to sustainable measures, we need to ask some questions like, are these needed by a single discipline, or do we need to integrate, have more heads come together? Is this just for a single building, or is it just for a single site, or are we actually bringing this together more on a campus level? And do we need to integrate how our sites and our facilities work together, or is it for a neighborhood? And if that's the case, how do we bring together a whole bunch of different entities and people that have different concerns and priorities to achieve sustainability? Or maybe, we're talking about on an installation, like most DoD installations. We're bringing together a whole bunch of different agencies and groups that may have competing priorities. And then last but not least, across an agency's property portfolio, are these sustainable measures ones that we're implementing only on, an agency's single facility, or is it ones that we want to implement across their entire portfolio? And as we all know, projects aren't standalone initiatives, but they are part of a comprehensive master plan, and that is called out in UFC 1-200-02 is that we need to also meet the master planning for installations, UFC, as well. And so the value of that planning is that we look beyond the individual project and we create synergies within the area or the installation or the campus or the neighborhood, whatever it happens to be. And that master plan can then kind of provide the vision and the goals and objectives for, for the overall area to be able to meet some of the sustainability initiatives. And when we do that, when we start with sustainable planning, then it leads to actually lasting development. And a big part of that is that maintenance piece, that portion of the work that happens a lot of times by the DPW or whoever it is that's going to maintain the facility, whether that's DPW or the campus that I'm working on right now, which is part of NSA. They have their own internal facilities folks, but they have to have buy-in so that all these tools that we put in place in our design and in selecting our site actually get maintained and get used to the full capabilities that they have going into the future. So we're going to look at 10 key principles real quick for sustainable planning. And these are ones that come out of that master planning UFC, but they apply to sustainable planning and our site specifically. So compact development. We're talking about appropriate mix of uses with integrated networks of streets and sidewalks. We want to encourage walking and alternative modes of transportation and accommodate appropriate residential and commercial densities. So every installation, whether or not, I mean, some installations are humongous. I understand that. I've been on some where they have acres and acres and acres of land, but even those have to conserve their land resources. Land is not something we get more of. And so installations have to figure out ways to reconfigure their current land use patterns and their transportation systems within their developed areas so that they create opportunities for future development. And so compact development patterns have to include things like multi-story buildings, greater residential density, mixed uses, minimal spacing between buildings, and making sure that while we do all that, we still can take into consideration things like ATFP requirements and other constraints that we are dealing with. But with all of that coming together, it takes a planning effort by the installation. Another priority for planning is infill development. So to try to conserve those limited land resources, we need to plan development within the installation core. So trying to maximize how we use the common spaces of our installations so that we can have a lot of people being able to have access to and using common spaces so we don't have to reproduce the same services and the same infrastructure multiple times on the same facility. If we can use it and keep a common core, we can reduce the amount of development that we need for the same types of services. This one's a tough one when it comes to the military, transit-oriented development, because a lot of times our installations don't lend themselves well to being also readily accessible via public transportation. Some do, but a lot of them do not. But if we're going to use transit-oriented development, it's going to focus on compact mixed-use development around transit corridors. It's going to place public transit stops along those corridors close to our facilities, and it's going to connect installation transit systems to outside transit systems. And this one is the connecting installation transit systems to outside transit systems is probably one of the ways that we can really maximize this one is to create those connection points. We're not always going to have the ability to have that public transit on our installation, but if we can make access points where we can access it via the installation, we can still maximize this transit-oriented development. Horizontal mixed uses. So horizontal mixed uses are when we try to use compatible uses within the same facility. Now, we try to do that as much as possible, but if we have incompatible kind of uses, we have to make sure that we appropriately segregate those things. So, for example, an industrial facility and a housing area, we couldn't, we don't want to have those two being right on top of each other. But for as much as we can, having horizontal mixed use is really a good way to limit widespread development. Vertical mixed uses. So with vertical mixed uses, we want to try to locate compatible users vertically within the same facilities. And so that's referred to as vertical mixed use. And so we achieve that vertical mixed use through good planning and development and synchronizing future projects. So if we know that we are going to have something coming down the road, if we can incorporate two projects into the same facility and not have to build another facility, then we can potentially maximize our vertical space use rather than sprawling out horizontally. Next best practice for planning is connected transportation networks. And so we've talked about this with our site to maximize the use of bicycles, pedestrian walkways, making sure that we link to appropriate surrounding transportation access. Using sustainable landscape elements. When we looked at reducing heat island effects, some of these are included in this. Appropriate use of trees and shrubs and ground cover for shade. Plantings that are suitable for the climate conditions and that don't use a lot of water. That's also a good best practice for sustainable landscape elements. The less water resources we have to use, the better. So if we can find something that is native and also doesn't require a lot of irrigation, that can conserve water resources. Low impact development and stormwater management. So the LID, and I know some of you are probably very passionate about low impact development. And so the use of on-site natural features to control stormwater runoff, quantity and quality is part of that whole planning process. We want to make sure that we add 10% additional site to allow integrated management practices, and we want to identify additional low impact development costs on our DD 1391 during project planning. So if we're going to put in place LID practices and strategies, we need to have a way to pay for it. And we also need to make sure that we have enough, that we have a site that can accommodate it. Another best practice for planning is multi-story construction, which kind of goes hand in hand with the vertical mixed use. The one-story buildings and facilities are the most inefficient use of valuable land. And since we can't get more land, we want to try to use multi-story construction whenever possible. And we do that, as we stated, with vertical use, is to combine multiple users in a facility as much as we can. And if we know that we're going to have multiple projects coming up, if we can combine them into a single facility and have multiple users, that will maximize the way that we use our sites and the land associated with those facilities. And going right along with site selection, building orientation and configuration is also part of the planning process. So we want to plan sites to provide flexibility for building orientation and configuration. There's nothing worse when you're trying to orient a facility on a site and your site has pretty much locked you into one orientation. So if we can provide a site or choose a site that gives us the maximum flexibility, that gives us a lot of options to be able to orient our building in a way that will give us better energy efficiency, will give us better lighting, and give us a better opportunity to create spaces that will be good for the health and well-being of the occupants. And so some of the other things that we can do through building orientation and configuration is to minimize obstructions from landscaping, structures, and topography, and allows us to footprint elements of 60 feet or less that allow us to have natural light and ventilation in our structures. All right, any questions? I think we're getting close to the end of our hour, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we can address those.
There was one question that perhaps for the group that Spenley put in here, asking if anyone has conducted a life cycle cost analysis that supports these recommendations. So, and anything related to the site development scope we've been discussing.
That'd be a good question. Not that I've seen. I mean, I'm sure if they're recommending in the master planning UFC to include some of the site features in the 1391. I would hope that somebody has done a life cycle cost analysis, but I have never seen one in particular to those.
Oh, we do have another one. Let's see. Another one, where does the solar rendering index come from? Asking if that's from the EPA. I think I'd have to look that up.
The SR, where does
the SRI
now
for the
are they talking about the requirements for SRI, or where does the information on what particular products, what their SRI is?
Second thing, where do you determine those numbers and such so that when you're choosing materials, you can choose correctly to begin with?
So most manufacturers of, especially roofing, will list their testing for their product and what the SRI values are. And I would say probably a lot of the other, like, some of the exterior wall manufacturers, maybe like metal panels, things like that would as well.
So they have this solar rendering index, but what is the authority jurisdiction that has come up with this whole idea of a solar rendering index? And if it's a government produced document, what agency would have it? Because who comes up with the solar rendering index criteria? I mean, some of these roofing companies are using it, but where do they get their criteria to determine their solar rendering index for each of their roofing colors and whatnot?
So,
that's where I was trying to figure out, where do you begin in the whole idea of the study? So Energy Star.
So, I mean, Energy Star is going to be. I don't know for sure that Energy Star has done anything with the SRI. I mean, they have their ratings for products based on a whole bunch of other criteria. SRI, I think, has been, at least for us, is through IGCC, are the ones who kind of set the SRI requirements. But then usually we rely on the manufacturers to do third-party testing to validate their SRI value.
It also has resources within it for things like, for example, concrete when you go into LEED, there is a section that references like if it's a, you know, like a brighter white kind of concrete, which you can specify based on like the aggregate and things of that nature. So for things that are kind of, there's not one manufacturer, there are guidelines that way. And picking up on what Jason said, the roofing manufacturers in particular have specific like testing that they actually do that's certified, and I'm not so sure that that's a government agency. It's like, I think, a testing standard, but I'd have to really go back and look. But in general, you could use LEED when you don't have anything hard and fast from a manufacturer.
Oh, ASTM.
Yeah, I see somebody put a ASTM for, thanks, Kelly,
No problem.
for the SRI. So hopefully that whoever the manufacturer's testing agency is has tested it for ASTM E 1980-11. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you guys for chiming in with your input. Appreciate that.
Thank you. We have our when's the next meeting? Is it a week?
On April 6th, we're going to be doing, I think it's tools and documentation. I've got that I'll be presenting.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I did have one more question. Sorry. Looking at ASTM E 1980, do we have that in our database anywhere? Because it's $59 and you can buy one.
Yeah, we have IHS standards you should be able to access through Whole Building Design Guide. If you haven't accessed that before, you'll have to register, but you just use your USACE email account.
All right. I'm new to the Corps. I've been in private practice mostly. Okay, great.
So the Whole Building Design Guide, if you haven't used it before, is a great reference for standards of all, you know, like it has, first of all, has all the UFCs and the regular guide specs, but also, like Kelly said, it has that outside standards to IHS, and so you can access. There's a handful of exceptions that aren't covered under IHS because I don't know, for whatever reason those standard holders have not released it to them, but for the most part, most standards are going to be included under there, and you can have access to them. Yeah,
Great.
Thanks, Kelly. Put the link for the Whole Building Design Guide and the non-government standards.
Thank you for your expertise.
Well, yeah, I'll look at if I can add a slide on that for the next presentation on the 6th.
Okay. Somebody just said they don't believe that IGCC is available through IHS anymore.
I thought I'd seen it last time I was in there, but that might have been December. So Jansen, if that's something we could check on, it should be part of our licensing agreement there for IHS.
Yeah, sure thing. I could take a look at that. But the last time I've been searching for IGCC references, I've been able to find them online for the latest versions. but we would rather have our folks look through a reliable resource. So we could look into that and see if we have those resources available in IHS or in our technical library.
Okay. Nobody else has any questions? I think I'll say thank you, everybody, for attending today. And once again, Jansen will have the recording, and we can post the slides up on the Teams site as well.